With a new confidence, Glasgow lifted its head and told the world that it was now miles better.
Today, Glasgow's Miles Better campaign went national. It's a campaign to tell the world that Glasgow, basically, is miles better than it used to be.
As a result, the world saw a more optimistic and playful city. Over 4 million came to visit the city at the Glasgow Garden Festival, the first event of its type to be held in the city in 50 years. Its significance in the rebirth of Glasgow was underlined 2 years later, when something previously unbelievable happened. Peripheral housing schemes were not ultimately a success, as there was a fundamental issue with almost all of them. There were houses, tens of thousands of them, but little else.
When we first moved out here as a family, we called it a graveyard with fairy lights, or sometimes a forest of wardrobes. One of the first things I ever remember feeling was being terribly cheated. But the wee faceless councillors in Glasgow had dispatched us out here, and we were supposed to feel great because we had a bath. But you know, you can only spend so much of your time in the bath playing with your rubber ducks and things.
For the hearts and minds of its poorly housed citizens, as more and more people began to resist moving to the peripheral housing schemes, the idea that their homes could be remodelled and improved instead of being demolished became increasingly attractive. And by the mid-70s, new terms began to be heard more frequently. Words like heritage and conservation.
When Lord Isher wrote his report in 1971 about the condition of Glasgow, he basically said, "Why are you knocking all this down? Are you mad? This is the most beautiful Victorian city in the world." And at that point, we were all thinking, this is a black dump. This is a horrible place to be. But Isha came from outside and said, "Oh, I've never been to Glasgow. This is absolutely fantastic." Everybody went, "Oh, well, hold on." And looking, actually, this is really quite nice.
Conservation was kind of not really known in the 60s in Glasgow. It became a thing in the 70s. The 60s wasn't. The future was the thing, although nobody had quite a really very clear idea of how the future would be.
I don't remember anybody talking about conservation. The word does seem to just emerge. Glasgow was full of Macintosh that was being neglected at that time.
Nobody cared about it. It was unbelievable now.
The auction rooms were full of Art Nouveau stuff that had been chucked out. You know, we were buying stuff for pennies.
Our mirror in the hall, for example, which is superb, sort of pewter Art Nouveau. How much was that?
About 30 pence.
30 pence. Nobody cared about that then. That was left to go to rack and ruin.
The introduction of home improvement grants in the mid-1970s empowered owners, rather than the council, to sort the problems of insanitary housing. Attention quickly turned from matters lavatorial to matters environmental.
We started looking at the city as an object of beauty, as an object of worth. The second part of that was the stone cleaning of the city in the 80s.
The decade of the scaffolder and the sandblaster had arrived. The Clean Air Acts of the 1950s and 60s meant that Glasgow could now shed its ugly black cloak without getting dirty again.
That was a remarkable change, absolutely remarkable change. There was sandstone and there was red sandstone. Later it became yellow sandstone when they were cleaned, and when the estate agents began to write their copy, it became blonde sandstone.
The stone cleaning was an absolute revelation. Because Glasgow, it was like it was under a black shroud before, and you just didn't look at the buildings. It was just black everywhere. And you knew there were big buildings, you knew there were big stone buildings, but all you saw was a big dirty black facade. And when they cleaned them, especially the old Glasgow buildings, the ones with the cream sandstones, you suddenly looked at them, and it was like someone had switched the Christmas lights on all year round.
The city was changing. It was now less overcrowded, as many had moved to new towns outside the city, and the charm of its buildings were easier to see now the black cover of pollution had been blasted away. Crucially, the shame of slum housing was also, at last, disappearing. With a new confidence, Glasgow lifted its head and told the world that it was now miles better.
Today, Glasgow's Miles Better campaign went national. It's a campaign to tell the world that Glasgow, basically, is miles better than it used to be.
As a result, the world saw a more optimistic and playful city. Over 4 million came to visit the city at the Glasgow Garden Festival, the first event of its type to be held in the city in 50 years. Its significance in the rebirth of Glasgow was underlined 2 years later, when something previously unbelievable happened.
Scotland's largest city, Glasgow, has been officially named Europe's cultural capital for 1990. Jacques Chirac, the mayor of Paris, last year's culture capital, handed on the title, and he spoke of the formidable renaissance of Glasgow.
It was a transformative moment. All of Europe's attention was now focused on a city that had, up to that point, a terrible reputation of blackened and filthy slums, set in a depressed landscape of destroyed buildings and failed housing schemes. Now, opera singers were entertaining huge crowds as part of a major cultural event. Glasgow, Scotland, Britain, and the rest of Europe all celebrated the phoenix-like rebirth of the city. The city had been saved, but there were casualties. Scores of magnificent buildings were lost at the hands of planners and developers in the 1960s and even in the 70s, when the concerns of conservationists were starting to be heard. The storm of 1968 marked the end of the utopian dream and the municipal desire to create the most modern city in Europe. It's taken 50 years, but most of the buildings being destroyed now are those from that time. The tallest are chewed up by giant machines or blown up in dramatic style. Now, instead of 29 comprehensive development areas in which almost everything was meant to be obliterated, the city has 25 conservation areas in which almost everything is preserved. And a tourist industry has developed, drawn to marvel at that which was not destroyed.
As a child, I thought Glasgow was a pretty dull, grim sort of place. And if you had said to me that 50 years later I would have difficulty crossing the road because of gangs of Chinese tourists following their tour guide, I just wouldn't have believed you. I thought you were pulling my leg.
And the humble tenement has had a renaissance.
The storm of 1968 has been deemed an ill wind that brought new insights. In the case of the Glasgow tenements, people started considering tenements as an acceptable place of living.
The great thing about tenements is they worked. They actually worked. That's why we still live in them today.
Great storm was God, who was fed up with the city not getting its housing right. He sent a storm to take the roofs off the buildings and make you realise the scale of the problem, get on with the job.